If you have your Bibles, I'd like to encourage you to turn to the 24th chapter of the book of Matthew. Now, over the last several months, it seems like, if it's not being the reality, we've been doing a study on eschatology. And if you don't know what eschatology is, it is the study of end times. And what we've been doing is looking at what the Bible says about end times, about the time that Jesus returns. We've talked about everything going back to Daniel. We've talked about all the things dealing with the many prophecies that people talk about today. And we have understood that those prophecies have come to a fulfillment. And we've talked about that many times. So rather than talking about what somebody thinks or what somebody desires, we are looking at God's Word. And we're looking at it to see what we need to do as God's children to be prepared for Jesus' return. Now, we're down here in the 24th chapter of the book of Matthew. And we had backed up to the previous chapters and talked about what Jesus was telling the Pharisees in the temple. And we find those writings back there, those parables. And if you go back and look at those, he's telling them that you messed up, it's too late. So we get down to chapter 24. And we know that Jesus had came out of the temple, that went to the Mount of Olives, and he made this statement. In verse 2, Matthew 24, he says, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." And we go back not only to the previous chapters, but also in this chapter. And he notes the reality of the time of this prophecy, and that it was going to come in the time of their generation. And we broke all that down. Now, you can go over on our Facebook page, you can go over on our YouTube page, and you can go back and you can watch all of these lessons that we have done on this topic. Going on down, we talked about those who misled, those false Jesuses. We talked about that. We also talked about the situation where at that time period, that there were many who came along and professed to be Jesus, professed to be the Messiah, or professed to be a prophet. Now, to understand that this came to fruition, we have been looking at history. And I will note tonight some historical references about what was going on at this time period. Now we understand, and I want to make this very clear always, these individuals that are historians who wrote during this time period and maybe a little after are not inspired by God. But they're good historians. They kept down what was going on in this situation and in this era. So we're down tonight to chapter 24, verse 6. And a lot of people are constantly talking about these so-called signs of the second coming of Jesus. Well, Jesus did not come in that generation. Jesus left in that generation. So we're backing up here to that time period between the cross and 70 AD. That's what we're talking about here, is the fall of Jerusalem. And even the historians bring to light these things happening in this time period. It says here in Matthew chapter 24, beginning verse 6, you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famine and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. When we think about, when we think about this, Jesus predicted in no uncertain terms that prior to the fall of Jerusalem, that there would be wars and rumors of wars, and that nations would rise against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms. And that became a truism. If you go back and you look at history, these historians, at that time period, those people in that area of the world were constantly at war with one another. Now again, we go to Matthew 24, 6 through 7. Wars, rumors of wars. That's a key factor. Luke puts it like this in Luke 21, verse 10. This is one of the parallels. It says, and he continued by saying to them, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes and in various places, plagues and famines, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. Now, Jesus predicted all of these things. This was what was going on between, again, AD 30, the cross, and AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem. And I've encouraged our group to go back and to look at some information concerning the siege of Jerusalem historically. And there are some good videos out there on that. It was a terrible thing, especially when we think about the Jewish revolt right before AD 70. So the disciples were warned that they would hear of these things. But I want you to see here at verse 6 what Jesus told them. See that you are not frightened. That's a key phrase. See that you are not frightened. Constantly in our world today, there are those out there, every time a little something happens in the Middle East, they come out in this big uproar. Oh, look, the signs are here. The signs are here. Jesus is coming. And now we hear this idea that, well, we've got some red heifers over in Jerusalem. We're going to start rebuilding the third temple. And it's going around. And people are fearful. It's scaring them to death. I was recently looking at a video about this. And the individuals was talking about how people who believe that these things that are promoted by the premillennialist, that they're scared to death. They're scared to death just to live in the world. And that's what this is all about. Is whenever you get up and you say, oh, these things are coming, they're coming, they're coming. We see all this. Well, their generation is the key. Don't be frightened. And here's the thing is they're talking to Christians here. Jesus is talking to those that are going to be Christians. He says, don't be afraid. And he's going to tell them what to do. Now, we won't be able to get that far tonight, but he will before it ever gets along. So, do not be fearful. Number one, because we hear wars and rumors of wars all the time. I mean, it's been going on for centuries. And it's going to continue to happen until Jesus does come. It's not a sign, but it was something that they needed to be cognizant of before the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, Tacius, a Roman historian, again, not inspired, said of this period, he said, the history on which I am entering is that of a period of disasters, terrible with battles, torn by civil struggle, horrible even in peace. 4 emperors fell by the sword. There were 3 civil wars, more foreign wars, and often both at the same time. And this is Tacius, the Histories, 1-2. Now you can go and look up these books on Google. All you got to do is type it in and it brings it up. Again, this is just an excerpt. It's not the entire reading. I would encourage you to go back and look at that. Go look those books up. Read the rest of it, because some of the things that they talk about, it's horrendous what was going on at this time. I think the frog got in my throat sometime last night. Now, Josephus, in his book, Wars, noted that the people of Caesarea had slain the Jews. They decided they didn't want the Jews in Caesarea anymore. They want to get rid of them. That were among them on the very same day and hour when the soldiers were slain, which one would think must have come to pass by the direction of providence, insomuch that in 1 hour's time above 20,000 Jews were killed, and all Caesarea was emptied of its Jewish inhabitants. Now I want you to look at that right here. If I can see it, 20,000 were killed. That's a lot of people. And the ones that got away, it says here in the rest of this, they were caught and they were put to the galleon. Is what it reads. So that was a terrible thing going on. That was a genocide, if you will. But it was happening there in Caesarea. So when we think about everything that was going on, it wasn't just in Israel. It wasn't just there in the promised land, but it was all over the place. It was throughout the entire area of the Mediterranean that they were having all of these struggles. Now, he also talks about famine and pestilence. So, as Jesus is answering the questions the disciples posed about what signs will precede the destruction of Jerusalem, he foretold about famine, pestilence, and of course, earthquakes in various places. Now, we don't have to go too far to understand that there was famines going on. We go to Matthew chapter 24 here, verses 7 and 8, talks about this. We also go to Luke chapter 21, where it talks about various places, plagues and famines, and there were terrors and great signs from heaven. But we go over to Acts 11, and we talk about Agabus. And he noted here in Acts 11:27, now at this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius. Famines, sadly, were quite common because they didn't have everything like we do. You know, we're fortunate that if we have a drought, which we have those quite often in this area, but they ship in the food and the groceries that we need. And we get stuff from literally around the world shipped into us, and we have plenty to eat. Well, these people weren't like that. They did store food. But after some of these situations that was going on at the time, food became short. Now think about this. If you're at war, food shortages is a reality. And if an army comes along and they're going to take you out, they're going to get your food. They're going to burn all your crops. They're going to destroy everything. Well, you know, we think about how terrible that is. In Jerusalem, during the siege, they did that to one another. The Jews inside of Jerusalem literally burned the food of their opponents inside Jerusalem, denoting the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the scribes, and all of those little sects that was inside the walls. They had already attacked one another, destroying the foodstuffs, and then the siege comes with Titus and the Roman army, and they had no food. And what did they do? They started eating one another. That's what they did. Terrible situation. Now, Josephus talks about Queen Helena and her efforts to help Jerusalem. Because in Antiquities 22:5, she was going to Jerusalem because she wanted to see the temple. She wanted to worship at the temple. She wanted to understand what was so great about this temple that all these Jews were going to and worshiping. Now, I've taken an excerpt here. It says, now her coming was a very great advantage to the people of Jerusalem. For whereas a famine did oppress them at that time, and many people died from want of what was necessary to produce food withal. Queen Helena sent some of her servants to Alexander with money to buy a great quantity of corn, and others to Cyprus to bring a cargo of dried figs. So during her visit, she found that they were in great need. These people had no food. They didn't have any, nothing. So she sends outside of there, Alexander, for corn, Cyprus for dried figs, to feed the people. So what I'm trying to show us here is that famine was not an unknown thing. People would starve because of this. And they had nothing. And it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around that because we have plenty. I guarantee you we have plenty to eat right here. But those folks didn't. In AD 51, Tacitus writes in Annals, this year witnessed many prodigies. Houses were flattened by repeated earthquakes. Further portents were seen in storages of corn, resulting in famine. In this year, war broke out between Armenians and the Iberians and seriously disturbed relations between Rome and Parthenia. Constant wars. And again, whenever you have a war situation like that, these people come in, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. If, here's the thing. If we have one little shortage, we get frantic. These people had nothing. 65 to 66, Tacitus wrote in Annals, heaven too marked this crime-stained year with tempest and pestilence. Campania was ravaged by a hurricane which destroyed homes, orchards, and crops. We have hurricanes here. You remember not many years ago, the hurricane that hit down in Louisiana flooded the place? People were devastated. Well, it happens all the time. You think about hurricanes that hit any place along the Gulf or on the East Coast. It's devastating. I've been up to see where the wildfires were in Texas. I've been up there. And it's awful. It's awful. The beef, a lot of beef cattle up there on that open range, or that range up there. It's not open range. But the price of cattle has really gone up. There was one, I think it was this last few days, a baby calf was bringing $1,000. I wished I had some. I'd sell them. I tell you what, I got 3 pigs I'd sell for $1,000 a piece, real quick. Keep me from having to feed them. But here's the thing: natural disasters happen, tornadoes, floods, and people find themselves without. Continuing, at Rome, a plague devastated the entire population. Well, we've understood about these so-called illnesses that plagued the whole world of recent. Everything was shut down, and it was a mess, still a mess. Well, this was something that happened pretty regular. This is 65 to 66. It says no miasma was discernible in the air, yet the houses were full of corpse, and the streets of funerals. Neither sex nor age confirmed immunity, slave or free, all subserved just as suddenly. So we understand that, especially thinking back to what we dealt with of recent times here in the world today. A plague was nothing new, but that's what Jesus was talking about. These people understood how bad it is. Now, I never underestimate the power of God and his righteousness or his love. And he allows a lot of things that I scratch my head about. But he allowed all these things that were going on in the world, that known world right there at this time period, to make certain that the Christians understood what they need to do and why. Because the destruction of Jerusalem was coming. And I think that's a key factor. Roman historian Suetonius documented that of series of droughts that caused the scarcity of grain during the reign of Claudius. And that goes back to the passage that we read over in Acts chapter 11. If you can't raise the crops, you can't feed yourself. Now, I figure most of us put in a big garden every year, can up all them groceries like Grandma and Granddad used to. No, most of us go down to the grocery store and we buy what we want and we take it home and we eat it. Well, Grandma and Granddad didn't do that. At my house, Mom and Daddy didn't do that either. And Linda and I, we do more nowadays than we used to. But I'm out there, I'll tell you what, I've been out there slaving away in that garden already. I've been out there getting it all prepared, and we're going to plant all this stuff and get ready to have plenty to eat. But if we have a drought and I have no water to water it with, even if I have the seed, I have the land, I have the tools, I have the tractor, I have the plows, I got everything. No water, no food. And it was a lot worse for these people than it would be to us. Because I can take water out of the well and water my garden if I want to. It's a struggle. Well, he talks about earthquakes. Matthew 24, verse 7 talks about these famines and these earthquakes. Luke 21:11 starts with the earthquakes. That area around the Mediterranean, there is a lot of volcanoes. And all that area is very tectonic. And I don't know if it's as tectonic today as it was at this time, but at this time period, it was very active. And it wasn't anything for them to have earthquakes and everything be knocked down. Now think about the way they built stuff. They didn't build it to take on earthquakes. Not until the Romans come up with the concrete. And it stood the earthquakes during this time period and a little after. J. Marcellus Kirk said, and as to earthquakes, many are mentioned by writers during the period just previous to 70 AD. There were earthquakes in Crete, Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, Samos, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Colossae, Campania, Rome, and Judea. It is interesting to note that the city of Pompeii was much damaged by an earthquake occurring on February the 5th, 63 AD. Now, what else do we know about Pompeii? Yeah, Vesuvius. Yeah, erupted, covered it up. Thousands and thousands of people died. And this was not something that was unheard of. This happened during that time period. Again, in my mind, God's letting these folks know you need to think about what's going on here. Now remember, all of this that we're talking about, Matthew 24, over in Mark, over in Luke, all this is going on prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in that generation. Now, Taccius noted that an earthquake demolished a large part of Pompeii. In the Annals 1522-2, it says this opinion was hailed with great unanimity, but the Senate resolution could not be finally passed as the consuls decided that there had been no formal motion on the subject. Then, at the emperor's suggestion, they decreed that no one was to propose to any council of our allies that a vote of thanks ought to be given to the Senate, to pro-praetors and pro-councils, and that no one was to discharge such a mission. During the same councilship, a gymnasium was wholly consumed by a stroke of lightning, and a statue of Nero within it was melted down to a shapeless mass of bronze. Think about that. They had lightning problems. Do we ever have lightning problems? Yes, same thing happens. It starts fires. An earthquake, too, demolished a large part of Pompeii, a populous town of Cappadocia. Can't say that word very well. And one of the vestal versions, Leah, died, and in her place was chosen Cornelia of the family of coC. Now that's all of that second verse there. Terrible things was going to happen. And we're just looking at a brief few tonight. There's a whole lot more out there. Seneca the Younger, around AD 60, stated, this tremor was on 5 February in the consulship of Regulus and Vergennes, and it inflicted devastation on Campania, for part of the town of Herculaneum. 2 fell down, and even the structures that remain are unstable. In other words, going back to the thing at Pompeii. So we think about all of these historical events. We think about what Jesus is talking about here in Matthew chapter 24, and of course, the parallels. These all were taking place. And he says in verse 8, but all these things are merely the beginning of birth pains. This is just the beginning with the destruction of Jerusalem and the establishment of Christianity. When somebody comes along and they say, oh, look what's going on in the world. Well, we're still having wars. There's still rumors of wars. We're still having famines. We're still having plagues. We're still having earthquakes. But it does not designate the coming of Jesus, because Jesus will appear and no one will know when. But when he comes, he comes. And there will be no signs that so many people are looking for today. So We'll begin there next Wednesday evening, Lord willing, and continue our study in Matthew 24 in these parallel passages.